Since the 1970s, the scientific community has accepted the idea that near death experiences do occur. And so today I'm going to talk about some of the evidence that is presented from the scientific community that you can find today in academic journals with respect to near death experiences. And then I'm going to talk about whether or not these correspond to our beliefs as a conservative Christian. And so our beliefs as a conservative Christian, of course, is that Jesus died, he resurrected from the dead, he was seen by his apostles over a period of 40 days, and then he ascended into heaven. And we believe he sits at the right hand of the Father, and one day he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. What we also believe is that Jesus is a light. He is the light and the love and the Prince of Peace. And we have much evidence in the Bible for this, but we also have evidence that people who've had encounters with Jesus over the centuries have verified, whether the encounters be in dreams or visions or personal encounters such as those by the apostles in the early first century. So we have some really exciting stuff. And so today I'm going to present to you some stuff that doesn't get so much into what people experience if they experience what they would call heaven or if they experience what they would call hell, because there are definitely those experiences. But there are many experiences that share a lot of commonalities across cultures and across the centuries. And these experiences are things like this light and a tunnel, and there's a feeling of immense and immeasurable love, and just a feeling of incredible peace and tranquility and serenity. And this sort of experience has been shared across cultures. And it's been shared during times that someone has been near death and their brain has been in a vegetable state. It's been experienced in those kind of a time when you're not a totally functioning brain. Your brain is in a vegetative state, and it's been experienced in other kinds of times. So this is really interesting stuff, because the scientific community sometimes are naturalists, and the near-death experiences that people have shared, thousands of people have shared, many, many, many in a population across the world have shared this. These experiences in many cases cannot be explained in a naturalistic way. So this throws the old naturalists into a bit of a crumble. They don't know exactly what to do to deal with this sort of experience. And so before I go, I want to say hi to my good friends here, Doki Doki SFT Fan Club. I'm going to be on Standing for Truth's channel not too long from now, early August, talking about the resurrection and the immense quantity of evidence that we have in support for it. And I also say hi to Nate B. and hi to Jesse Camping. Jesse was on my channel not too long ago, it was a while back, and we talked about some really cool stuff from the ancient Near East. And so that was pretty exciting. You might want to go back and listen to that conversation if you haven't had a chance. So here we go. We're going to talk about some good stuff. And so get excited, because get your popcorn. You are going to enjoy this. It took me a while to put together this presentation. I dug it up in academic articles. I found a lot of really cool stuff. It's going to be exciting, I'm telling you. So we shall press on here to the slides. So the first thing is, now this is from Frontiers in Human Neuroscience, and it says, and this is a journal article that came in 2014, issue 8, and starting on page 203. And it said near-death experiences in non-life-threatening events and coma of different etiologies. And so this was co-authored by a number of academics. And so here's what it says. The expression near-death experience was first formulated in the 19th century when a Swiss geologist collected testimonies from his fellow climbers and himself after making a fall in the Alps. This is from Heim in 1891. Some decades later, Moody, 1975, popularized the expression through his bestseller, Life After Life, in which he defined near-death experiences as any conscious, perceptual experience occurring in individuals pronounced clinically dead or who came very close to physical death, and drew a list of the most frequently recounted features by individuals who had survived near-fatal incidents. These NDE features included, so this is what a lot of people are saying, so just listen to this: overwhelming feelings of peacefulness and well-being, painlessness, the impression of being located outside one's physical body, the impression of drifting through a dark environment that looks like a tunnel, the sight of a brilliant light, and the feeling of being surrounded by it, the impression of discovering another world, described as idyllic, the feeling of a close presence, the encounter and communication with spirits or deceased relatives, or experiencing a life review. More recently, NDEs have been defined as a profound psychological event, including transcendental and mystical elements, typically occurring to individuals close to death or in situations of intense physical or emotional danger. That's from Grayson in 2000. In a survey of 1,357 individuals in the general population in the United Kingdom, Italy, and Germany, 5.8% reported at least one out of body experience in which they could see their body, their spirit had been lifted out of the body, and they could view themselves. The question the surveyors asked was, do you have a sense that you are outside of your body and watching yourself? And that's by O'Hayan and in the year 2000, Psychiatry Research. Another journal from Nelson and colleagues in neurology says in 76% of near-death experiences, subjects reported out-of-body experiences. Now, just as interesting side note, my mom told me that she had an out-of-body experience while she was giving birth to me. She felt herself being lifted out of her body and was sort of at the top of the hospital room, looking down, watching the nurses performing the removal of my little body from her body. So it was when she was giving birth to me. She had this near-death experience, which I found fascinating. She had an out-of-body experience, I should say, in that case. So here's from Gary Habermas. I didn't realize Gary Habermas has done some research on near-death experiences, but this article comes from Liberty University in fall of 1996. And here's what he says. He talked about Susan Blackmore, who I believe is an atheist, and he looked at some things that Susan had said. And he said near-death experiences are described similarly across cultures and throughout history. They're very realistic. In fact, in all the different studies that I've been finding, people say the experience is realer than real. It seems more real than the experiences we have on Earth. And he says the experiencers say they cannot deny their authenticity. Their memories of these kind of experiences last for a very long time without any sort of corruption. They're very real to them. They don't just fade over time like so many of our earthly memories. He said no naturalistic hypothesis can account for the paranormal data reported. Blackmore uses a dying brain hypothesis to claim that when brains are deprived of oxygen, they release endorphins and develop events to combat threats to the brain. We'll notice, though, a couple of commonalities. One is experiences are frequently transformed afterwards, becoming less materialistic. In fact, a lot of them become more communal, focusing much more closely on their friends and their family than they'd ever done before. Many of them are very reflective and appreciative. In fact, I saw lots of situations where people talked of gratitude and how appreciative they were for even the pain and suffering that they'd gone through. They felt that each painful experience that they have is something that is bringing them closer to that great light and love that they had felt during the near-death experience. In fact, it sort of reminds me of what the apostles said when they were being thrown into the prisons. You saw in the book of Acts, when Peter and others were thrown into the prisons, and Paul, they would start singing and laughing and just being appreciative of the fact that they were able to even take a beating in the name of Jesus, for Jesus' sake. They knew that they were working their ways towards heaven. Here's what Gary Habermas says, and I'll quote, Blackmore considers the famous tennis shoe report of social worker Kimberly Clark Sharp to be one of the most potentially important cases of remote viewing. In other words, you can discount the claim that people do not have out-of-body experiences if you can show that while they had an out-of-body experience, they saw something that they couldn't have possibly known about. And there have been a number of these cases reported where people reported seeing what the doctors were doing in the hospital room when they were completely unconscious. They were visualizing with the doctors how they were moving. There was one case of a truck driver who was 55. He saw a doctor, what it looked to him like flapping his arms, but the doctor wasn't saying anything, so it wasn't like he heard him. His eyes were shut and everything, but he saw the doctor flapping his arms. Later found out that the doctor was explaining a certain procedure to his nurses. And that it couldn't have known that he was outside of his body. Now, there's this other case with Kimberly Clark Sharp reported where there was this woman called Maria, and she reported seeing a shoe on the top of a hospital. It says Maria, a heart attack victim, reported a near-death experience in which she saw a number of confirmed items, both in and out of Harborview Hospital in Seattle. But more interestingly, she told Sharp that she especially concentrated on a single item. Now, this is while she was out of her body being operated on. A tennis shoe located on a hospital ledge around the corner of the building she entered and currently occupied. Maria explained that the shoe had worn little toe and the lace was under the heel. After unsuccessful attempts to find the object, Sharp finally located and retrieved the shoe. So this shoe was in a place that this woman could not have possibly seen. Apparently, it was her first visit to the hospital. She'd never been there before, and this is what she saw. Another more evidential case was reported by a pediatrician named Melvin Morse, who resuscitated a young girl who had nearly drowned after being underwater for 19 minutes. With massive swelling of the brain, fixed and dilated pupils, and breathing with the assistance of an artificial lung, Katie had perhaps a 10% chance of surviving. 3 days later, she recovered fully. In the follow-up exam, Katie correctly described Morse and another physician, plus numerous other details of the emergency room, as well as the resuscitation, in spite of the fact she was profoundly comatose during the entire experience with her eyes closed. Perhaps more convincingly, Katie could also recall many details far beyond the hospital. In one glimpse inside her own home, she described what her mother was preparing for dinner, roast chicken and rice, where her father was sitting and what he was doing, as well as the specific toys being played with by her brother and sister. When Morse checked the details, the family confirmed that these events had occurred just days before. Again, more corroboration of events. This helps refute or discount the claims that there's naturalistic ways to explain this. Now, how could we really discount it? What if we have records of blind people seeing? Especially people who were born blind, have never seen colors, never seen other people, never seen anything like what we've experienced. Well, we do. Here, stay tuned. Here we go. This is good stuff. I want to say hi also to my good friend, Dr. Nose. Good to see you. Jesse Camping, all you guys. Nate B. Always good to see you guys. So here's a report from Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper in the Journal of Near-Death Studies. It says near-death and out-of-body experiences in the blind, a study of apparent eyeless vision. It says this article reports the result of an investigation into near-death and out-of-body experiences in 31 blind respondents. The study sought to address three main questions. One, whether blind individuals have near-death experiences, and if so, whether they are the same as or different from those who see or sighted persons. Two, whether blind persons ever claim to see during near DEs and out-of-body experiences. And three, if such claims are made, whether they can be corroborated by reference to independent evidence. He says, they say, our findings revealed that blind persons, including those blind from birth, do report classic near-death experiences of the kind common to sighted persons, that the great preponderance of blind persons claim to see during near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences, and that occasionally claims of visually based knowledge that could not have been obtained by normal means can be independently corroborated. Okay, so let's just give you a little example here. Vicky Umapeg, who was blind from birth. Now, this is fascinating stuff. You're going to like this. According to her testimony, Vicky first had a fleeting image. Now, again, she was blind from birth. She was apparently a premature baby in the 1950s, and she was put into the encasement that they're put into when they're first born. And apparently she received way too much oxygen. They hadn't been monitoring it properly, and it blinded her or contributed to her blindness. So she's been forever blind. But here's what she says. Vicky had a first fleeting image of herself lying on a metal table, and she was sure, she said, that it was me. Although it took her a moment to register that fact with certainty. As she later told us, now again, here she's in a hospital room. She finds herself out of her body, looking down at her body. And even though she had never has physically seen her body, she had this certainty that this was her. And here's what she says. I knew it was me. I was pretty thin then. I was quite tall and thin at that point. And I recognized at first that it was a body. But I didn't even know that it was mine initially. Then I perceived that I was up on the ceiling, and I thought, well, that's kind of weird. What am I doing here? I thought, well, this must be me. Am I dead? I just briefly saw this body, and I knew that it was mine because I wasn't in mine. Then I was just away from it. It was that quick. Almost immediately after that, as she recalls, she found herself going up through the ceilings of the hospital until she was above the roof of the building itself, during which time she had a brief panoramic view of her surroundings. She felt very exhilarated during this ascension and enjoyed tremendously the freedom of movement she was experiencing. She also began to hear sublimely beautiful and exquisitely harmonious music, akin to the sound of wind chimes. With scarcely a notable transition, she then discovered she had been sucked headfirst into a tube and felt that she was being pulled up into it. The enclosure itself was dark, Vicky said, yet she was aware that she was moving towards light. As she reached the opening of the tube, the music that she had heard earlier seemed to be transformed into hymns, similar to those she heard during her previous near death experience. And she said, then rolled out to find herself lying on the grass. She was surrounded by trees and flowers and a vast number of people. She was in a place of tremendous light, and the light, Vicky said, was something you could feel as well as see. What the light conveyed was love. Even the people she saw were bright and reflected the light of this love. Everybody there was made of light, and I was made of light. There was love everywhere, and it was like love came from the grass, love came from the birds, love came from the trees. Vicky then became aware of 5 specific persons she knew in life who were welcoming her to this place. Debbie and Diane were Vicky's blind schoolmates who had died years before at ages 11 and 6, respectively. In life, they had both been profoundly retarded as well as blind, but here they appeared bright and beautiful, healthy and vitally alive, and no longer children, but as Vicky phrased it, in their prime. In addition, Vicky reports seeing 2 of her childhood caretakers, a couple named Mr. and Mrs. Zilk, both of whom had also previously died. Finally, there was Vicky's grandmother, who had essentially raised Vicky and who had died just 2 years before this incident. Her grandmother, who was further back than the others, was reaching out to hug Vicky. In these encounters, no actual words were exchanged, Vicky says, but only feelings of love and welcome. In the midst of this rapture, Vicky was suddenly overcome with a sense of total knowledge. I had a feeling that I knew everything, and like everything made sense. I just knew that this was where the place was there I would find the answers to all of the questions about life and about the planets and about God and about everything. It's like the place was the knowing. And these revelations were unfolding. Vicky noticed that now next to her was a figure whose radiance was far greater than the illumination of any of the persons she had so far encountered. Immediately, she recognized this being to be Jesus, for she had seen him once before during her previous near-death experience. He greeted her tenderly while she conveyed her excitement to him about her newfound omniscience and her joy at being there with him again. Telepathically, he communicated to her, "Isn't it wonderful? Everything is beautiful here and it fits together, and you'll find that. But you can't stay here now. It's not your time to be here yet, and you have to go back." Vicky reacted, understandably enough, with extreme disappointment and protested vehemently, "No, I want to stay with you." But the being assured her that she would come back. But for now, she had to go back and learn and teach more about loving and forgiving. Still resistant, however, Vicky then learned that she also needed to go back to have her children. With that, Vicky, who was then childless, but who desperately wanted to have children, and who has since given birth to 3, became almost eager to return. So that's how that worked out for Vicky. So that is a pretty excellent experience. Now, some other refutations are the brain's instinct to fight. Now, some people have said, okay, this is a naturalistic theory. They say your brain has an instinct to fight when threatened. And this refutation, though, can be debunked if we can show that people have these sorts of experiences when not near death and when brains aren't threatened. Okay, so the fight brain theory, this is the one that Susan Blackmore was talking about. Number one, these experiences have transcended. People see things that they couldn't possibly see. Blind people are able to describe people they couldn't possibly describe without having seen them in these sort of situations, which is what happened in the case with Vicky Umapeg. But here's another situation where we have a near-death experience when you weren't having a life-threatening event. So here's the case going back to the same journal I mentioned before, Frontiers in Human Neuroscience. Again, near-death experiences in non-life-threatening events and coma. Okay, so in this particular case, it says near death experiences are increasingly being reported as a clearly identifiable physiological and psychological reality of clinical significance. However, the definition and causes of the phenomenon, as well as the identification of near death experiencers, is still a matter of debate. To date, the most widely used standardized tool to identify and characterize near death experiences in research is the Grayson NDE scale. Using this scale, retrospective and prospective studies have been trying to estimate their incidence in various populations, but few studies have attempted to associate the experiencer's intensity and content to etiology. So, what this particular study did said this retrospective investigation assessed the intensity and the most frequently encountered features of self reported near death experiences after a life threatening event or after a pathological coma. These are I'm sorry, the first one is after a non-life threatening event, and the next one is after a pathological coma, what they have in quotations real NDE versus NDE like. The latter is the one describing the non-life threatening event. And they said from our 190 reports who met the criteria for a near-death experience using the Grayson scale, what they found is they did not differ. In other words, the non-near-death experience, the near-death experience-like situations, and the real ones, the ones where they were life-threatening, were the same. The experiences were the same. And so making the claim that the brain is in this fight mode, which is what it would be in if you imagine what would be in a serious near-death experience, that is a claim that's refuted when you can compare the two situations, one in that sort of fight mode and the other not, and the results are that the groups do not differ. Now, just so that you know what a coma looks like, some people say, well, a brain's still functioning during a near-death experience. Well, not really. Here, take a look on the left here. You can see a healthy brain when it's functioning. You can see all kinds of activity going on in that brain. In the middle here, you see the dead brain, completely dead, non-functioning. And in the right, you see the vegetative state. This is what a brain looks like when it's in a coma. It's just, again, vegetative. So Ken Vincent in the Journal of Near Eastern Near-Death Studies, here's what he said. Near-death experiences and other transpersonal experiences, those that transcend the usual personal experiential limits of space and or time, point to the existence and nature of God, an ongoing personal consciousness following physical death. In this article, I review the history of these experiences prior to 1850 and of their study during 3 periods of scientific research between 1850 and the present. I conclude that 1, a large percentage of the population has experienced near-death experiences and other transpersonal experiences. 2, the overwhelming majority of the experiencers are mentally healthy. And 3, these experiences change people's lives for the better. I contend that although near-death experiences and other transpersonal experiences cannot prove the existence of a personal God in afterlife, they definitely point to them. So here's the report again from the researchers Ken Vincent, and I'm quoting him. This is right from his study. All of human history is testimony to humanity's experience of the transpersonal. Prior to research into transpersonal experiences by biomedical researchers and other social sciences, these accounts were often anecdotal and frequently much told tales. 2,500 years ago, Plato recorded the NDE of in his Republic around the 4th century. First-hand accounts from credible sources in the ancient world are rare. Zoroaster composed a poem that documented his direct experience of God. And St. Paul also told in his own writings of his life transforming out-of-body experience or after-death encounter of Jesus. Additionally, St. Paul told of his out-of-body experience in which he transported to the 3rd level of heaven. Actually, in 2 Corinthians 12, it doesn't report that Paul himself went to the 3rd level of heaven. It said he knew of somebody who went to the 3rd level of heaven. Okay, so that is referenced in the 2nd book of Corinthians. In the 6th century, St. Gregory the Great, in Book 4 of his Dialogues, provided a treasure trove of transpersonal experiences, including these near-death experiences, after-death communications, and others in vivid dreams. And so these and other examples from ancient and medieval literature have some validity by the very fact that they sound so similar to modern transpersonal accounts. So here's what we have. But in most cases, we don't have enough in the ancient record to make judgment on the veracity of the story. In her analysis of medieval and modern accounts of otherworld journeys, Carol Zaleski noted, "We cannot simply peel away the literary wrapper and put our hand on an embellished event, even when a vision actually did occur. It is likely to have been reworked many times before it being recorded." She suggested, for example, that the church would have been eager to ensure that recorded accounts did not contradict truth as defined by church doctrine. Nevertheless, in the medieval world, first-hand accounts of transpersonal experiences became more commonly reported in the lives of the saints. A modern interdisciplinary collaboration between a historian and a psychiatrist into medieval transpersonal experiences revealed that visions appeared to have been related to mental illness in only 4 of the 134 cases the authors studied, by Kroll and Bachrach, 1982. Next, moving beyond self-selected sample methodology, researchers undertook large-scale survey research. In 1977, David Hay and Anne Morrissey asked the same question to a British national sample of 1,865 persons. 35% responded yes. Between the times of the appeal in the British newspaper and the objective large-scale population survey, Andrew Greeley, 1974, and his colleagues at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago began asking a similar question. Have you ever felt as though you were very close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? A sample of 1,467 Americans showed 39% answered yes. Okay, 39% in this random sample of Americans said that they had had an out-of-body experience. Over the years, repeated national samples have shown that the number of people responding affirmatively to this question has ranged from 35% to 50%, according to Wood in 1989. Now, I can say in my family, the only person who's ever reported that is my mother. As I mentioned before, she had an out-of-body experience while giving birth to me in the hospital. No one else, as far as I know, has had that in my family. When respondents have been interviewed rather than surveyed, the number has increased to over 60%. Possibly because more Americans are feeling more confident in their spirituality, or maybe because the question was phrased differently. When asked recently, in general, how often would you say you had experienced God's presence or a spiritual force and felt very close to you? 86% of Americans reported one or more transpersonal experiences. Who knows? Maybe we humans are coming out of our spiritual closet. They also took medication effects into account. The apparitions of the dying in both the US and India, there was a study with the US and India, involved dead relatives and religious figures. In no case in either the US pilot study or the cross-cultural study was the takeaway person, the relative or religious figure whom the patient perceived had come to take the patient to the afterlife, an apparition of a living individual. In other words, every time people have these sort of out-of-body experiences or they have experiences where they encounter relatives, it's never been a case where the relative was living. It's always been the case when the relative is deceased. And even in some situations, the relative was deceased and the person didn't even realize the relative had deceased at that point. Discovered later. There's a couple of cases that I found where a young child reported that he had seen a sister or a brother, or even in some cases, someone who was unknown to him as a sister or brother, that no one had ever told him he had this sister or brother who deceased before the person was born. These kids reported having seen those people. 1/10 of the Americans and 1/3 of the Indians expressed negative emotions when religious figures appeared. Indians were more anxious about dying, probably because the Hindu religion teaches judgment. However, once the dying experience began, it was almost always pleasant for both Indians and Americans. The only report of a person going to hell was that of an Italian-American woman. The most striking difference between deathbed experiences in the US and India is one that could have been anticipated. The religious experiences or figures that came to take the person into the afterlife corresponded to the person's religion. Okay, so I want to build on this point, and this is why one of the reasons I'm making this video. Christians saw God, Jesus, angels, and Mary Hindus saw figures such as Yamaraj, the Hindu god of death, as well as Krishna, Rama, and Durga. Okay, so note that people reported that the figures that they saw in the afterlife when they're having these near-death experiences matched those they would expect to see. The question is, some would say, well, if you're a Christian, well, then certainly the Christians did see Jesus, but the Hindus must have been mistaken. I would argue perhaps the Hindus weren't mistaken. Go back to Psalm 82 and take a look at the fact when the Lord talks about sitting above the divine council of other spiritual gods and spiritual beings. Who's to say that the gods that the Hindus worship aren't spiritual beings? Okay, who's to say there really isn't a Krishna? I believe it's quite possible there are these other spiritual beings, and I believe it's made clear in Psalm 82. Okay, and other verses, Deuteronomy 32, Genesis 6. We've got a number of other verses that point to this, but I'll speak more on that in just a moment. My point is that it's possible that there are other spiritual beings out there, not worthy of worship, but that are out there. That's one of the reasons we talk about the Most High God. The implication is that there are other lower level, not to be worshiped gods. When the astronomer Carl Sagan, acting as an armchair psychoanalyst, made the claim that NDEs were just people reliving their birth experiences, his theory was soon refuted in an article by Carl Becker that included data on not only newborn physiology, but also the lack of similarity between features of the NDE and birth. In other words, what Carl Sagan was saying is the reason that people think they're going through some sort of a canal or a tunnel is because they're really going through a birth canal. And at the end of the birth canal, there's light. That's Carl Sagan's comparison to the near-death experience of the tunnel and light to going through the mother's birth canal. In a study by Susan Blackmore, 1983, entitled Birth and OBE, she found no difference in reports of passing through a tunnel as a transition into another reality for persons born by cesarean section or delivered vaginally. In other words, that's knocked out right there. My two kids came by cesarean section. They did not go through my birth tunnel. But what this is saying is that there is not a birth tunnel experience for all these people reporting a tunnel experience. Finally, although the majority of NDEs are pleasurable, the process of birth is widely acknowledged to be traumatic. In all of recorded history, only one person is said to have laughed instead of crying at birth, Zoroaster, strangely enough. Now, there's a religion named after him. Sagan has not been the only skeptic of the NDE, but this case does illustrate that when questions are raised, scientific investigation follows. The search for God and afterlife in the age of science highlights an overlooked aspect of the so-called conflict between religion and science. For the past 150 years, social and biomedical scientists have researched the very nature of religion itself, using all the tools available to modern science. NDEs and other transpersonal experiences can be and are investigated in the same way all other psychological phenomena are investigated. The validity of these experiences is based on several data sources, including case studies of transpersonal experience, sociological surveys that reveal who and what percentage of the population have NDEs and other transpersonal experiences, psychological assessment instruments that measure not only the mental health of the individual, but also evaluate the depth of mystical experiences, biomedical and neuroscience testing, including the EEG, PET scan, and functional MRI, to, in some cases, document genuine altered state of consciousness and demonstrate that transpersonal experiences are not just wishful thinking. This is well backed. Okay, so it says here in this particular author, in my opinion, although the NDE and other transpersonal experiences do not prove the existence of a personal God in afterlife, they definitely point to it. Research to date documents that fact, okay, that a large percentage of the population has experienced this. Overwhelming majority of people who have them are mentally healthy and not psychotic. I'm just saying what I said before. NDEs and other transpersonal experiences change people's lives for the better. Now, here's another study from Michael Nahm and Joachim Nicolai out of Germany. And this is from the Journal of Near-Death Studies. Essential features of 8 published Muslim near-death experiences. Okay, so a little study on some Muslims, and this is pretty interesting stuff. So, among other authors, Joel Ibrahim Krebs has recently published accounts of Muslim near death experiences. With the present paper, we aim to contribute to the growing number of non Western NDE reports by providing summaries of 8 additional Muslim near death experiences, 7 translated from the original Italian source, and 1 from an English source. Okay, it says although the documentation standard of the available cases is generally low, non-Western Muslim communities are largely similar to those reported in the Western near-death experience literature. In his report, Krebs concluded that Muslim near-death experiences are rare and that Muslims have fewer NDEs than do non-Muslim Westerners and non-Muslim non-Westerners such as the Chinese. However, we found that the number of Muslim NDE accounts available today seem to indicate that they're not as rare as had earlier been concluded. Now, here's a couple of interesting stories. Fonzo was impressed by the fact that some features the near-death experiencers related did not fit into the usual afterlife expectations of the Muslim culture. At least one of the NDEers, a nurse who was injured at a car accident, was considerably bewildered by this discrepancy. Examples of such cultural discordance include the tunnel and light experiences, out-of-body experiences, the religious figure sending the NDEer back, and in the case of the distressing NDE, experiencing a profound loneliness instead of encountering tormenting demons as Muslims might expect. But also minor particulars puzzled Fonzo. For example, the 12-year-old boy who was surprised to see green grassland instead of yellow sand and to hear music that didn't feature familiar instruments, reported communicating telepathically with deceased family members, a faculty the boy may never have heard of. Because of these discrepancies with NDEers' cultural and personal belief systems, Fonzo concluded that these NDEs could not have been mere hallucinations. Okay, so here's a couple of interesting examples. Now listen to this one. Syriana, a Lebanese woman born into a wealthy and religious family, recounted how a missile hit their house when the family was getting ready to eat. Now, of course, you remember in Syria or Lebanon, we've been having some intense wars over the years. And so she said after the explosion, all 5 family members had left their bodies and floated upwards into a tunnel of light where they met deceased relatives. They communicated telepathically with each other and were informed that Syriana and her father were to return. Within a second, both found themselves back in their bodies under the table in their now destroyed home. Apparently, both remembered this episode, thus providing a strange example, really unique example of a shared near-death experience. Now, how do these all relate to Christianity? We talk about this. So again, you see the light, you see the tunnel. There are some other studies that have been out there talking about people thinking that they were reincarnated. Now, I'm going to accentuate the fact that Christianity, that is one thing that Christianity does not support. So I did not report these cases because I feel that there is another explanation for reincarnation claims that are out there. Now, you'll remember that the Eastern faiths do believe that people are reincarnated into their bodies. They believe that the universe is operating in a continuous cycle and that sort of there's not much rhyme or reason to it exactly. You don't have a full explanation of exactly why you leave one body, die, and appear in another body back on the earth. But that's what the Indian faiths, the Buddhists, that's what Hindu people believe. They believe that in reincarnation, they believe in reincarnation not only to other humans, in the Hindu faith, into other castes. Possibly, if you do well in life, you go into a higher caste. If you don't do so well, you might end up in the Dalit caste or the untouchables. And so that's to note. But as I say, so we've got this situation. I hope I didn't just turn off my microphone. Okay, so so that's what they believe. They believe you come back. Now, there have been some situations where people have reported that they think they're born into another body. They might cite examples of other persons in previous lives who lived before them, who died before them. They think they've come back into their bodies, and they can cite some unique details about these other people. I would make the argument that we do know we're in a spiritual battle and that other spirits do influence people and do inform people and do get involved in dreams. We do have evidence of that in the Bible, but we also have evidence of that outside. And there is a potential that somebody, some other form might try to influence somebody to believe in a system that goes counter to what the Bible says. Here's what the Bible says on reincarnation. In Hebrews 9:27, it says, "And as it is appointed unto men once to die, but after this the judgment." Psalm 78:39, "He remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and comes not again." These are two verses in direct refutation of the idea that you can be reincarnated. Now, this other idea, perennialism, that all doors lead to heaven, that no matter where you are on the earth, no matter what you believe in, no matter what you do, no matter which faith you believe, whether you're an atheist, even if you worship Satan, everyone is eventually going to be reconciled to God. That is one interpretation. Now, in the Bible, it goes against that. In John 14:6, it says, "Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man come to the Father but by me." John 8:12, "Then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life." Now, recall that these near-death experiences universally, in many cases, I shouldn't say universally, but in many, many cases, mention a light, a loving light, a light of unconditional love at the end of a tunnel that some people are able to find. "And these shall go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into life eternal." Now, there have been some near-death experiences that people have reported very negative occurrences. Sometimes they encounter people who look like they're suffering tremendously, and they're in a situation that looks quite hellish. And sometimes they've talked about things like fire and brimstone and those sorts of things. And that you'll see reflected in Matthew 25:46. Now, in John 5:24, it says, "Verily, verily, I say unto you, he that heareth my word and believeth on him that sent me hath everlasting life, and shall not come into condemnation, but is passed from death unto life." That's John 5:24. Now, here's some verses on the conscience. Some people say when they have these near-death experiences, their life flashes before their eyes. They feel they encounter a light. Some feel that, in fact, there's a person who's, now his name is suddenly escaping me, Alexander, Ibn Alexander. He had an experience that he felt that his life flashed before his eyes, and he was given a unique opportunity to sort of judge himself. And he felt like he was on his way to something that could be like heaven. He felt that he was in some sort of a transition mode, going on the wing of a butterfly, is how he described it. He was in some existence that incredibly beautiful music was playing at one angle, but he kept dropping down into a really bad situation where he was hearing the thumping on top of anvils. Strangely enough, the one time I had a dream, and this is just a dream, not a near-death experience, but I had a dream once. I was being chased by some demon-like figures. They threw something at me and started yelling the word anvil. And I woke up thinking, anvil? What in the world is that? All I could think of was Bugs Bunny and how they used to drop this little anvil on top of people. But I looked it up and found it's an ancient tool. So it was interesting that Ibn Alexander used the exact same word to describe the part of his experience that was quite unpleasant, where he was dropping down into this existence and hearing this thumping, really clashing on anvils. And then he would all of a sudden start seeking the light, and he found himself rising up on the wing of a butterfly. Really interesting experience, but he also felt that that was some sort of a transitional phase between the earth and between what could be, what potentially could be, but what he had not been able to achieve. No, he didn't quite, even though his book is related to heaven, he hadn't made it to heaven. He made it to an existence that was heavenly, heaven-like, and what he thought was perhaps on his way towards a heavenly existence. But the idea that he said he didn't encounter this final judgment, the being of light was loving and seemed like unconditional love and did not judge him. He felt he was judging himself. But that just speaks to, while you're in this existence, this transitory mode in which you're able to have a self-reflection. And that goes back to the book of Romans, which shew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile, accusing or else excusing one another. See, the Lord has planted a conscience within each of us. So, of course, there is going to be a period of time, whether it's while you're on your deathbed or it's during some meditations in life, or maybe it's in your transition between here and the heavenly world, that you'll be reflecting on that. And that's been repeated time and again by people experiencing near death. Now, here's another verse, 2 Corinthians. Of course, this is the one I was talking about before. In that academic article, they thought Paul had experienced this third heaven, but that's not what Paul said. Paul said, "I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago, Whether in the body, I cannot tell, or whether out of the body, I cannot tell. God knoweth. Such and one caught up to the third heaven. Now, here's another one on this idea that people can appear from the dead and you can summon them, because some people have said that you can do that. And they might say, oh, no, that's something that's outside of the Bible. Well, the idea in the Bible is you're not supposed to do this. The last thing you're supposed to do is try to summon the dead. In fact, it's quite clear that you're not supposed to do that. However, in the Bible, it doesn't say that it's not possible for the dead to somehow appear to you, because in the Bible, the dead did appear to Saul. Here's the example. It's in the book of 1 Samuel. Then the woman asked, whom shall I bring up for you? Bring up Samuel, he said. That's Saul. When the woman saw Samuel, again, bringing him up from the dead, Samuel was dead, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? The woman said, I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth. What does he look like? He asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? I am in great distress, Saul said. The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do. Samuel said, why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, David. And again, you can see this one report in the Bible in 1 Samuel 28, 11 to 17. Kind of fascinating stuff. Now, another thing, just this idea that there could be other spiritual powers, that people who say, hey, I think I saw this one God, I think I saw this goddess, this thing I've been worshiping. There could be other spiritual beings out in the world deceiving people. That's something that's quite consistent with what's in the Bible. In fact, it's right in here in Psalm 82. God presides in the great assembly. He renders judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the unjust and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. The gods know nothing. They understand nothing. They walk out in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. Now, as Michael Heiser in his book Unseen Realm has reported, you take this verse and you can blend it with a number of other verses to develop a bigger picture of exactly what's going on here. During this time in the Old Testament period, God had given authority to these spiritual beings over all sorts of places. Okay, he'd given a sort of a spiritual authority. And you can see that in the book of Daniel when they speak of some of the kings, the king of Greece having had some sort of angelic authority, but not from these spiritual beings. Okay, you can also see when they talk about Michael, the archangel, in the book of Daniel, and how he had to fight one of these other authorities to be able to get past him to come to Daniel. So we can see that sort of a thing. We see that, again, these authorities, these gods had been given authorities in the Old Testament. What Jesus did when he came by his death and resurrection is he was able to take the authority away from these people, go back and reclaim the lands, which is what he did. But that's not to say that those spiritual beings aren't still in some sort of a different dimension of existence. And that's what we believe. That's what's part of Christianity. Although some Christians are less comfortable with this kind of a thing, it's definitely woven throughout the Bible. You can even see in other verses, other related verses. So here's another one. This is what Jesus did. He said, and Jesus came and spake unto them, saying, all power is given to me in heaven and in earth. Matthew 28:18. That was a reference to saying he had reclaimed the land from all of these other spiritual beings. They had done the wrong. They did wrong by humans. They did a terrible job in their jobs, they were supposed to be serving humanity and helping the poor and the weak. Instead, they were doing things that were really capricious. So now we get the last verse that I want to talk about, and it's a relevant verse to an evil world. Some people say, why are we in this crazy world? Why is it so evil? Is there a spiritual battle going on, and is that consistent with what the Bible says? Now, of course, in the New Testament, there are numerous times Jesus cures people of their demons. And there's a situation where the demons were taken out of a man, the legion of demons, and they ended up in a group of pigs that ran into the water. But here's what Paul says in Ephesians. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that he may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not with flesh, not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. That's in Ephesians 6:10-18. And so I hope you enjoyed that little presentation on near-death experiences. If I had to conclude this, if I had to give a conclusion for a lot of the stuff that I'm mentioning today, is I want to just let you know that the scientific consensus from many people is that yes, these near-death experiences do occur. The cause of the near-death experiences is what's questioned. And the naturalistic person will try to say that it's some sort of a strange functioning of a functioning brain. However, we can show that in many cases, these near-death experiences are occurring when the brain is pretty much without function in a vegetative state. We can also show that in near-death experiences, people see, hear, and witness things that they couldn't possibly see, hear, and witness in, say, a vegetative state, or in a state of having been born blind or being blind. If you're a blind person and suddenly you're able to describe other people, that gives you some pretty strong evidence that you're given some sort of a spiritual reality. Again, I mentioned some cases of that, but there are numerous cases that you can find. And so we have evidence of that. The next question is, how can we explain it? It can be explained in the context of the Bible quite well, with Jesus being the light and the love at the end of the tunnel. You remember the narrow gate that's given in the Christianity. We also have this idea that we're supposed to strive for the narrow gate, strive for through the tunnel for the light, and that Jesus is peace and tranquility and serenity. And that is the beautiful part of how we can marry Christianity to some of the experiences that people have in these near-death experiences or near-death-like experiences. So I'm coming back to the chat. I want to say hi to people I see here. I see Blaster Master and Joseph Turkett and Stripper Liquor. And so a lot of fascinating people. Hope you guys had a good time. Thank you, Jesus. Great to see you. Dr. Nose, always good to see you too. So it's just been a wonderful day. Got a kind of a busy Wednesday for me. I've got a ton of work to do over the next week and a half. And then hopefully I'll be able to settle down a little bit and make some more videos and more interesting stuff. So if there's any particular topics you guys would like to talk about here, listen to, join me in, I'd love to have that happen. I am going to be on Standing for Truth's channel coming up in October. Thinking the date. What date is it again? I want to say it's October 6th. Pretty sure it's October 6th. And I think it's right around 4 in the afternoon, Standing for Truth's channel. I'm going to talk about the evidence that we have for Jesus' resurrection. It's an abundance of evidence. I'm also going to be featuring Praise That I Am on my channel this Sunday. So be sure you tune in for that. Praise That I Am hasn't been on my channel before. So he's a friend of Standing for Truth. They're all kind of a little squad of fun people. So I'm going to have him come on my channel and talk about what he believes and what he thinks and sort of his dealings on a daily basis with a lot of people who are out there in social media battling sides, one sides or other sides. And so we'll have him on a channel too. And I'm looking at hosting some debates. So I've been working on setting that up. I've got one debate set up so far with Josh Brister and David Smalley. And that's also going to be on October 6th. So if you haven't caught that, Josh Brister is a Christian with his website called Christian Resistance. And David Smalley is a comedian / atheist. He's been on my channel once, and I've been on his podcast, which is called Dogma Debate, twice. He actually has one of those little blue check marks on Twitter. So I guess Twitter considers him quite a celebrity. So he's coming on my channel to debate Josh Brister. And I'm also working on having Jeff Williams back on my channel with Ken Ami. Now, Jeff's been on my channel as an atheist twice, debating Christians. And Ken Ami has been on my channel as a Christian. And so Ken is going to express the Christian viewpoint in this debate on whether or not Christianity is a reasonable path to take. And so I hope that you guys plan to come back. I hope that you'll like and subscribe and do come again. And just remember, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all in the glory of God. Thank you so much.